People think revenge begins with anger. It doesn't. It begins with memory, with noticing the small things others ignore, and with learning, very early in life, what silence can protect and what it can destroy. I raised my granddaughter alone, not because I planned to, not because I wanted to be strong, but because life has a way of removing people and leaving you holding what matters most. Her mother, my daughter, died when she was still learning how to read, and just like that, the world went quiet. No arguments, no family meetings, no volunteers. Just a child standing in a black dress, holding my hand too tightly, and me realizing that, from that moment on, I would have to see for both of us. Raising a child alone does something to you. You stop trusting promises. You stop believing appearances. And you learn to watch people, not when they speak, but when they think no one important is listening. I learned that lesson long before money ever entered the conversation. People look at me now and think I'm just an old woman with good posture and careful words. They don't see the years I spent choosing silence over explanation. They don't see the nights I stayed awake, calculating risks instead of dreaming. They don't see the contracts I read twice, while others celebrated too early. And that's exactly how I prefer it. Because wealth, real wealth, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself at weddings. It doesn't wear labels. And it certainly doesn't introduce itself to strangers who ask too many questions too quickly. Real wealth waits. I didn't teach my granddaughter how to chase money. I taught her how to recognize hunger in other people's eyes, how to notice when kindness changes tone, how compliments start sounding like inventory, how smiles linger just a second too long when someone thinks there's something to gain. By the time she was old enough to fall in love, she already knew how to listen without responding. That skill alone is worth more than most inheritances. When she got engaged, people congratulated her. But they watched me. I noticed it immediately. Suddenly, there were more questions than blessings, more curiosity than joy, more interest in where we come from than in who she had become, and that's when I understood something important. This wedding wasn't just about love. It was about access. 2 days before she walked down the aisle, I called her into my room. No raised voice, no fear, no drama, just a sentence spoken calmly, carefully, and with more intention than anyone in that house realized. I said, "Never tell your mother-in-law about the inheritance. Not now, not later, not after champagne, not after grandchildren. Because once money becomes part of the marriage, truth becomes negotiable, and loyalty starts asking questions it shouldn't." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, and in that moment, I knew something else too. The real test hadn't even begun, because what happened 24 hours after the wedding confirmed everything I had spent a lifetime preparing her for. People assume secrets are meant to be confessed. They're wrong. Some secrets are meant to be maintained, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. And the inheritance everyone now whispers about was never meant to be a story. It was meant to be a structure. I didn't come from money. I came from responsibility, from families where land mattered more than names, where agreements were honored with handshakes long before lawyers entered the room. The wealth didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, through businesses no one bothered to brag about, through properties passed down without celebration, through decisions made by people who understood that attention is expensive. By the time the number reached 200 million, it had already learned how to hide. And so had I. What most people don't understand is this: money like that isn't owned. It's managed. It lives inside trusts, layered like time capsules, each one unlocking only when certain behaviors are proven, when certain years pass, when certain mistakes are not made. There are clauses that don't forgive impatience, clauses that watch marriages closely, clauses that punish entitlement far more severely than debt. That inheritance doesn't reward excitement, it rewards restraint. I spent decades learning how to protect it from three things: carelessness, conversation, and people who believe marriage entitles them to information. I never sat my granddaughter down and told her the full number. Children don't need numbers, they need principles. So I taught her this instead. If someone asks about your money too soon, they are already planning how to use it. If they want details before commitment, they are testing boundaries. And if they smile while asking, they've practiced that smile. As she grew older, I let her understand the weight, not the figure, enough to respect it, enough to guard it, enough to never mention it casually. Because casual knowledge is the most dangerous kind. People don't steal what they don't believe exists, and they don't plot against what they can't measure. When she started dating, I watched quietly, not her. Then I listened to what her partners asked about first. I noticed who changed after learning where we lived, who suddenly wanted to discuss financial planning before discussing values. Those men didn't last long, and none of them ever knew why. Then she met her husband. He was different, not perfect, but patient, not impressive, but present. He asked about her work, not our assets. He spoke about building, not inheriting. And most importantly, he never asked me a single question about money. That alone earned my respect. But families don't marry individuals. They marry networks. And networks have agendas. His mother, she never asked directly. That's what made her dangerous. She asked sideways questions. Your grandmother seems very comfortable. Your family must be proud of what they've built. Some people plan generationally. It's admirable. Statements dressed as compliments. Fishing lines without hooks. I said nothing. I smiled. And I marked the moment, because the inheritance had one unbreakable rule. The moment it becomes leverage, it becomes protected. Any attempt to access it prematurely, any legal curiosity, any documentation request without cause, triggers reviews, delays, locks, silence. This wasn't paranoia, it was experience. I had watched families tear themselves apart over far less. I had seen kindness evaporate once numbers entered the room. I had witnessed love turn into negotiation. And I refused to let that be her story. That's why, 2 days before the wedding, I spoke, not because I was afraid of losing money, but because I had something far more valuable to protect: her peace, her marriage, her future. I knew something most people don't realize until it's too late. Once information leaves your mouth, you don't get to choose how it's used. And once money becomes part of someone else's imagination, they will rearrange their morals to reach it. What I didn't know then was how quickly that imagination would turn into action, because what arrived 24 hours after the wedding wasn't curiosity, it was documentation. You can learn a great deal about a person by how carefully they pretend not to be interested. She never raised her voice, never overstepped, at least not in ways that could be named, and she never once asked a question she couldn't later deny. That's what made her different. And that's what made her dangerous. From the moment I met her, she was pleasant. Not warm, not cold, just controlled. The kind of woman who listens with her head slightly tilted, as if everything you say is being filed away for later. She complimented my granddaughter's manners, praised her independence, admired her grounding, words chosen carefully. Like someone who had rehearsed them, she spoke often about family, about unity, about traditions, but she rarely spoke about sacrifice. And women who have sacrificed recognize that absence immediately. At the engagement dinner, she sat across from me, not beside her son, not next to her husband, across from me. That wasn't coincidence. She wanted to see how I reacted when certain topics surfaced. She didn't ask where our money came from. She asked how long we had lived in our home. She didn't ask about business. She asked whether the property had been in the family long. She didn't ask about inheritance. She asked whether I believed in planning for the next generation. Each question innocent on its own. Together, a map. I answered the way I always do. Vaguely, politely, without direction. I spoke of values, not figures. History, not holdings. Effort, not outcomes. And every time I did, her smile tightened, just slightly. Because I wasn't giving her what she came for. The night before the wedding, she hugged me, held on just a moment too long, and whispered, "You must be so proud of what you've built. Not raised, not protected, built." That word matters, because people who use it assume ownership can be transferred. I smiled, thanked her, and made a mental note. I didn't warn my granddaughter because I distrusted her future family. I warned her because I recognized timing. Because when people start counting before they're invited to the table, they usually arrive hungry. The mother-in-law didn't need confirmation. She only needed probability, and probability to someone like her was reason enough to act. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't see, was that the inheritance had already anticipated her. Every question she asked, every assumption she made, every step she planned to take, she thought patience would give her access. She didn't realize patience was the test. 2 days before the wedding, the house was full. Voices in every room, laughter spilling down the hallway. Garment bags hanging from door frames like quiet promises, but I waited. I've learned that important conversations don't belong in noisy places. They belong in moments people remember. That evening, after the last guest had gone and the lights were dimmed, I called my granddaughter into my room. Not urgently, not dramatically, just a gentle knock on her door. She sat across from me on the edge of the bed, still glowing from excitement, her hands folded the way they were when she was a little girl, and knew she was about to listen, not argue. I didn't begin with warnings. I began with truth. I told her how proud I was. Not of the wedding. Not of the man she was marrying. But of the woman she had become, independent, observant, kind without being careless. Then I paused. Because praise opens the heart, but pauses invite attention. I said, "There are some things a woman learns only by watching others lose." She looked at me, fully present now. So I continued. I told her that marriage changes how people listen to you. That once a ring is on your finger, some people stop hearing you and start hearing access. That families, no matter how polite, sometimes confuse love with entitlement. Then I said the sentence I had practiced in my mind for weeks. Slowly, without emotion, without fear. Never tell your mother-in-law about the inheritance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain immediately. I let the words settle between us. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask why. That's when I knew she was ready to hear the rest. I told her this wasn't about suspicion. It was about timing. That information has weight, and weight shifts relationships. That money, once mentioned, changes expectations even in good people. And that no marriage should begin with invisible hands reaching in. I said, if your marriage is strong, it won't need money to prove it. And if it isn't, money will only expose what love couldn't fix. She asked me one question. Only one. What if they ask? I smiled. Because that question told me she understood more than she realized. I told her the truth. That silence is not dishonesty. That privacy is not betrayal. That some truths are not owed. They are earned. I reminded her that she wasn't hiding anything from her husband. She was protecting the marriage from becoming a negotiation before it had even learned how to breathe. Then I told her something I had never said aloud before. That the inheritance was designed to reveal character, not reward proximity. That anyone who tried to reach for it too soon would only tighten its locks. And that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a filter. She nodded slowly. No fear, no defiance, just understanding. She promised me, not dramatically, not emotionally, just a simple agreement between two women who had learned the same lesson at different times. As she stood to leave, I stopped her. And I said one final thing. Watch what happens after the wedding. Not what people say, but what they do. She kissed my cheek, turned off the light, and left me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time, not worried, not anxious, just prepared. Because when you've lived long enough, you learn that warnings don't prevent storms. They teach you where to stand when they arrive. And the storm was already forming. Weddings are loud with happiness, music, laughter, champagne glasses clinking too often. They give people permission to stop paying attention. That's when the most important things happen. I arrived early, not to help, not to supervise, to observe. I took my seat before the aisle filled, before faces softened, before joy blurred intention. I've learned that people reveal themselves best when they believe the moment isn't about them. The ceremony was beautiful, simple, tasteful, nothing excessive, which made certain reactions noticeable. Some guests watched the bride, some watched the groom, and some, very few, watched the room. I noticed who looked at the guest list before the altar, who scanned faces during the vows, who leaned in when certain surnames were announced. The mother-in-law didn't cry. That's not unusual. But she didn't look at her son when he spoke either. Her eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, across the first 2 rows. Counting, not people. Positions. She smiled at the right moments. Clapped at the right times. But her attention kept drifting, not toward the couple, but toward the audience, as if she were confirming something. At the reception, I watched from a distance. I didn't hover. I didn't interfere. I let the room speak. She moved gracefully from table to table, not mingling, surveying. She asked guests how they knew the family, what line of work they were in, where they were based. Harmless questions. Social questions. The kind people answer freely after a drink or two. But she didn't ask everyone. She selected those with tailored suits, those with quiet confidence, those who didn't need to explain themselves. I noticed something else. She didn't introduce herself as the groom's mother. She introduced herself as family, a small word, a strategic one. When the speeches began, the room softened, voices trembled. People wiped their eyes, and that's when I saw it. During my granddaughter's speech, when she thanked the woman who raised me, the mother-in-law's expression changed. Not offended, not touched, calculating. She turned, not to me, but to her sister, whispered something. Her sister nodded. That exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. But 3 seconds is a long time when you know what to look for. Later, while the photographer rearranged groups, she stood close enough to hear me speak. Not close enough to seem intrusive. Just close enough. Someone complimented the venue. I replied politely. She smiled and said, "Your family has excellent taste. Not you. Not she. Your family. Words matter." As the evening went on, I noticed who approached me. Not out of warmth, out of curiosity. People I had never met suddenly wanted to chat. Wanted to know how long I'd lived in the area. What my late husband did. Whether I planned to slow down now. Someone had started something. A rumor. A suggestion. A possibility. I said nothing. I smiled. I danced once. I left early. As I walked out, I looked back. The couple were laughing, unaware. Exactly as they should be. Love deserves its moment unbothered by calculation. But as for the others, they were already rearranging the future in their minds. I didn't feel fear. I felt confirmation. Because when people start paying attention to things that don't belong to them, they eventually announce it. And they did. Just not that night. The morning after the wedding was quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels deliberate. No congratulatory calls. No cheerful messages about the ceremony. No polite follow-ups from people who had been smiling too brightly the night before. Just nothing. Newlyweds usually wake up to noise. Family checking in. Friends replaying moments. voices overlapping with affection. But this time, the air felt held, as if someone, somewhere, was waiting for instructions. I noticed it immediately, because silence after celebration is never accidental. I didn't ask questions. I didn't call anyone. I made tea, sat by the window, and waited. Experience teaches you this. When people go quiet all at once, they're either ashamed or organizing. By midday, the absence became noticeable. No visit from the mother-in-law. No invitation to brunch. No warm messages about joining families. Just distance. Calculated distance. My granddaughter called me around noon. Her voice was light, but careful. She asked how I was feeling. Not how I slept. Not whether I enjoyed the wedding. How I was feeling. That told me something had already shifted. I reassured her. Told her to enjoy her day. To rest. To let happiness settle before the world interrupted it. She thanked me. But before hanging up, she hesitated. Just a second too long. I didn't press. I never press when someone is about to learn something for themselves. The afternoon passed slowly. Sunlight moved across the floor. Time stretched. And still, nothing. By evening I knew. This wasn't distance. It was preparation. People who intend to ask for something don't rush. They build confidence first. They align their stories. They decide who speaks and who observes. That night I reviewed documents I hadn't looked at in years. Not because I expected trouble, because I respect patterns. And patterns were repeating themselves with familiar precision. I slept well. That surprises people when I say it. But fear comes from uncertainty, and I had none. The next morning, I woke early, dressed carefully, not elegantly, intentionally. At exactly 10 minutes past 9, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual knock, not a neighbor's knock. A formal one. Measured. Patient. I didn't rush to answer. I finished my tea. Stood slowly. And reminded myself of something I had learned long ago. When people arrive in silence, they rarely come to listen. I opened the door and saw everything I had expected. Because silence, when broken, always explains itself. When I opened the door, no one smiled. That was the first confirmation. They stood in a neat line, my granddaughter's mother-in-law, her sister, and a man holding a leather folder against his chest, like a shield. He wore a suit that suggested respectability rather than wealth. That matters. People who truly understand money don't need to dress like it. The mother-in-law spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost courteous. She said my name as if we were about to discuss wedding photos. "This won't take long," she said. "We just need to clarify a few things." That sentence has ended more peace than most arguments. She gestured toward the man beside her. "Our notary." Not a notary. Our notary. I stepped aside and let them in. Not because I felt obligated, but because refusing entry would have interrupted something far more revealing. They sat exactly where they chose, not where I offered. The notary placed the folder on the table, opened it carefully, and aligned the pages as if the room itself were under review. No one mentioned the wedding. No congratulations. No warmth. Straight to business. The mother-in-law folded her hands and said, "We believe it's best to have transparency early in a marriage." Transparency. Another word that sounds generous until you hear who's asking for it. She continued. "There are assets connected to this family that affect my son's future." She paused, just long enough to imply she already knew. I said nothing. Silence invites overconfidence. The notary cleared his throat, spoke about protective documentation, about shared understanding, about preventing complications later. He slid a document toward me, not aggressively, confidently. I looked at it, didn't touch it. The paper requested confirmation, not proof, not access, confirmation, as if the conclusion had already been reached. I finally spoke. Only one sentence. "Who told you there was anything to confirm?" The room changed. The mother-in-law smiled, not warmly, reassuringly. The smile of someone who believes resistance is temporary. We don't need names, she said. Families talk. That was the moment. The exact moment. When assumption crossed into entitlement. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my hands, and said calmly, families talk, but trusts listen. The notary froze, just slightly. I explained not defensively, not emotionally, that any inquiry of this nature automatically triggered review protocols, that even asking the question through formal channels altered timelines, that assumptions carried consequences. The mother-in-law interrupted me. She shouldn't have. We're not asking for access, she said. Just clarity. I looked at her then, really looked, and said, clarity comes after trust, not before. The notary finally spoke again, asked if I would be willing to sign a simple acknowledgement, just to close the loop. I smiled. For the first time since they arrived. And I said, there is no loop to close. Then I told them something they hadn't prepared for, that the inheritance was not singular, not immediate, not negotiable, that it was governed by behavioral clauses, including discretion, patience, and non-interference, and that this visit, this very visit, had been recorded. The mother-in-law's posture stiffened. Her sister looked away. The notary closed his folder slowly. No one raised their voice. No one argued, because suddenly, they understood. They hadn't come to unlock anything. They had come to seal it shut. I stood, signaling the meeting was over, and said gently, for the sake of the marriage, I suggest you leave now and never repeat this mistake. They didn't apologize. People like that never do. They gathered their things quietly, avoided my eyes, and left exactly the way they arrived, certain of everything, and now, certain of nothing. Because the most painful realization isn't that you've lost access. It's discovering you were never entitled to it in the first place. After they left, I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I didn't replay the conversation. I've learned that when something goes wrong, emotion can wait, information cannot. People assume betrayal always comes from the obvious place. It rarely does. Most leaks don't come from malice. They come from loose tongues and unfinished conversations. I made a list. Not on paper. In my head, everyone who knew anything, and I mean anything beyond what could be guessed. The list was short. It always is. I ruled out my granddaughter immediately. She had learned too well. Her silence during that visit wasn't fear. It was discipline. The husband? Possible, but unlikely. Men talk when they want approval. He had never needed mine. So I went back further. Years back, to conversations I had dismissed as harmless at the time. I remembered a former business associate, someone I had trusted with fragments. Not numbers, not structures, just enough context to understand the scale, not the mechanics. He had always been impressed. Too impressed, the kind of man who repeated what you told him, as if it were already his story to tell. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but distance doesn't erase relevance. I made one phone call. I didn't accuse. I didn't interrogate. I asked one question. Who have you spoken to recently about old projects? Silence. That familiar pause. The one that confirms more than any confession. He admitted it eventually. Casually. Almost proudly. He had mentioned in passing that my family was very well protected. Not rich, not wealthy, protected. He hadn't given names, he hadn't shared documents, but he had offered possibility. And possibility is enough for the ambitious. I thanked him, hung up, and crossed his name off the list. The discovery didn't anger me. It clarified something important. Information doesn't need to be accurate to be dangerous. It only needs to be believable. The mother-in-law hadn't acted on facts. She acted on probability. She filled in the blanks with expectation. And expectation, when paired with entitlement, moves quickly. That explained the confidence, the notary, the paperwork. They believed they were confirming something inevitable. What they didn't understand was this: the inheritance wasn't designed to respond to curiosity, it was designed to respond to behavior. The moment they arrived with documentation, they created a record that now existed independently of intent. The system doesn't care why you knock, only that you did. I reviewed the trust protocols that evening, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to see exactly how the system would interpret their actions. The result was precise, cold, fair. Access timelines extended, discretion clauses activated, oversight increased, no confrontation required, no emotion involved. They had accelerated the very outcome they feared. I didn't inform my granddaughter immediately. Some lessons settle better when allowed to unfold. She would understand soon enough. That night, I slept deeply, because truth once located has a way of calming the mind. The real discovery wasn't who spoke. It was this: people who chase what they haven't earned usually reveal themselves long before they're invited in. And the story wasn't finished yet. People think traps are dramatic. They imagine slammed doors, raised voices, sudden reversals. But the most effective traps are invisible, the kind you walk into calmly, believing you're in control. They thought they were early, prepared, proactive. What they didn't realize was that the inheritance had been built to observe behavior, not reward proximity. That trust was designed decades ago, not by lawyers who chase headlines, but by people who had already seen families collapse under the weight of expectation. It assumed one thing would always be true: someone eventually would reach too soon, and when they did, the system would respond. The moment the mother-in-law arrived with a notary, several things happened automatically. No alerts, no phone calls, no visible reaction, just internal adjustments. Reviews were triggered, oversight increased, timelines extended, not by days or months, but by years. Because impatience is not a small flaw, it's a character assessment. The trust doesn't punish curiosity, it measures intent. And intent reveals itself not through questions but through action. They didn't ask privately. They didn't wait. They didn't allow the marriage to settle. They arrived with paperwork that told the system everything it needed to know. What they believed was initiative was interpreted as interference. One clause, in particular, was very clear: any third-party attempt to formalize, document, or extract information without explicit invitation resulted in restricted access. Not permanently, just long enough to matter. I didn't celebrate when I read that. I didn't feel victorious. Because this wasn't revenge. It was design working exactly as intended. The trap wasn't emotional. It was structural. They didn't lose money. They lost time. And for people who move fast to secure advantage, time is everything. Weeks passed, then months. No follow-up visits. No misunderstandings. No apologies disguised as concern. Just distance. Careful distance. I heard through channels I trust that conversations had shifted from when to if, from confidence to confusion. The mother-in-law had believed that proximity created leverage. What she learned instead was this: proximity creates visibility, and visibility invites scrutiny. Meanwhile, my granddaughter's marriage settled into something steady, not flashy, not performative, real, and that mattered, because the trust watched stability closely. It always had. The irony is this: if they had waited, if they had focused on relationship instead of access, if they had trusted time instead of paperwork, none of this would have happened. But entitlement has a way of speeding people up. And speed reveals more than patience ever will. I never told them what they had triggered. I never explained consequences. I never needed to. Silence did the work for me. Because the most effective response to overreach is letting the system speak in your place. They thought they were walking into clarity. What they walked into was confirmation. The confrontation didn't happen right away. People expect explosions. They expect raised voices, accusations, doors slammed hard enough to shake walls. That's not how women like me do things. It happened weeks later, after emotions cooled, after assumptions had nowhere left to hide, after silence had done its work. The mother-in-law requested a meeting, not formally, not officially. A message passed quietly through family channels. She wanted to clear the air. I agreed, not because I owed her clarity, but because clarity, when given at the right moment, can end a story properly. We met in a neutral place. Not my home, not hers. Somewhere public enough to keep everyone honest. She arrived alone. That was new. No sister, no notary. Just her purse held close, like armor she no longer fully trusted. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather, health, safe ground. Then she sighed. I think things may have gone too far, she said. Not wrong. Too far. I didn't interrupt. People reveal their true position when allowed to speak uninterrupted. She explained herself. Carefully. She spoke of concern, of wanting to protect her son, of misunderstanding intentions. I waited until she finished. Then I spoke. Slowly, clearly, without softness, and without cruelty. I told her I understood the instinct to protect family. But protection without permission becomes intrusion. And intrusion has consequences. I explained briefly that what she interpreted as secrecy was simply structure, that wealth governed by emotion doesn't last, and that marriages tested by entitlement fracture early. She tried to respond. I raised my hand. Not aggressively. Decisively. This is not a negotiation, I said. And it never was. I told her something she hadn't considered. That my granddaughter's silence was not deception. It was discipline. That love does not require disclosure on demand. And that respect is shown by waiting to be invited. Her face changed then. Not anger. Recognition. She asked one final question, quietly, almost reluctantly. Is there any way to undo what happened? I looked at her, and for the first time I saw uncertainty, not strategy. I answered honestly. Time will decide, I said. And behavior. I reminded her that trust isn't repaired by explanation. It's repaired by restraint, by learning when not to reach. We sat in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just final. When we stood to leave, she thanked me. Not warmly, not graciously, but sincerely. That was enough. Because confrontations don't need winners. They need boundaries. And boundaries, once drawn, speak louder than anger ever could. Some people think shouting is power. They learn too late that calm is far more expensive. After the conversation, nothing dramatic happened. No apologies announced. No sudden warmth. No public acknowledgments of missteps. And that was how I knew it had landed. Families rarely change in moments. They change in patterns. In what is no longer attempted. In what questions stop being asked. In the spaces people learn not to enter. The visits became shorter. The calls less frequent, but also more respectful. No more probing disguised as concern. No more careful compliments aimed at uncovering information. Just conversation. Surface level, perhaps. But honest. My granddaughter noticed it too. She didn't need to ask. She felt it. The difference between being evaluated and being accepted. Her marriage settled into something quiet and sturdy, not perfect. Real. They learned each other's habits, argued about small things, laughed without performing. And most importantly, money was no longer in the room. That absence was the greatest gift I could have given her. The trust continued to do what it was designed to do. Observe, wait, measure consistency. No punishments, no rewards rushed, just time doing what time does best. I didn't explain everything to my granddaughter. Some lessons arrive more clearly when discovered on one's own. But one evening, she sat beside me and said, "You were right. I didn't ask about what. I didn't need to. She told me she finally understood that privacy wasn't about hiding. It was about protecting the shape of her life. That told me everything. The mother-in-law never brought up the inheritance again. Not indirectly. Not casually. Not even in frustration. The subject simply disappeared. And with it, the tension. People assume revenge looks like triumph. But the most satisfying resolution is peace. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that lets you sleep. I watched my granddaughter grow into a woman who understood that boundaries aren't walls, they're filters, and only what belongs gets through. In the end, no one lost face, but everyone learned where they stood. And that, for families like ours, was more than enough. If you've listened this far, you already understand something younger women often learn too late. Life doesn't test us with noise. It tests us with access. It tests who we allow close, what we explain too quickly, and how often we mistake politeness for loyalty. I didn't tell this story to warn you about money. Money is only a mirror. I told it because many women spend their lives building something, a family, a home, a sense of peace, only to feel pressured to justify it to people who didn't help build it. You don't owe explanations for your boundaries. You don't owe disclosure for your dignity. And you certainly don't owe access to anyone who arrives with expectations instead of respect. If you're a woman who has raised children, held families together, or quietly protected what mattered while others underestimated you, this story is already yours. The greatest revenge isn't humiliation. It's stability. It's watching the next generation live freely, because you chose restraint over reaction. So I'll leave you with this. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. And wisdom does not announce itself. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share it with another woman who understands what it means to protect a legacy. Not just money, but peace. Leave a comment below and tell me, what lesson did life teach you that no one warned you about? Your words may guide someone who needs them more than you realize. And if you believe stories like this, stories of quiet strength, boundaries, and earned wisdom, deserve a place in the world, subscribe. Because some truths are best told by women who have lived long enough to recognize them.